Hey everyone, and welcome to part 3 of our project implementation tutorials. By now, Pygame is set up and ready for us to use, so we can move on to implementing the game-specific functionality. And we'll begin by implementing our item class. This will be a custom class that represents either an item or an item button within our game. We'll actually use the same class for both of these components. The class will be fairly simple, so we just need to set up some initial fields in that class. Then we're going to import some images into our project to use for each item or item button. And then we'll draw the buttons onto our buttons bar. And just for reference, this is what our item UML diagram will look like. Each item will need X and Y positions. Each item will also need a health and happiness value. And each item will also have an image associated with it and a rectangle that represents the image's proportions and position. As for the methods, well, items don't really do a whole lot in our game. They exist more to be interacted with, so all we really need is an initializer that sets up our primary 5 values. The image rect itself will be obtained based on the size of the image. Okay, so now we know what we're going to be implementing. Let's head over to the code and get started. Alright, so this is pretty much where we left off last time. We had just finished setting up Pygame, and we have the display code here. We have a drawing function, and then we also have a function to actually start off the game loop. We ran the code and saw that we're indeed seeing a blank white window. Okay, so our next order of business is again to implement this item class, which we can either do in a separate file, so go ahead and create a new file if you like to keep things organized that way, but I'm actually going to stick the class within the same file so we can have everything in main.py. It's not going to be a very complex class, so I think this is okay to do, but it's really your personal preference. So let's go ahead and start up an item class. We'll of course need an initializer for that. And as per the specifications, we'll need X and Y positions, we'll need values for health and happiness, and we'll also need an image name. Now this image name is going to be a string that corresponds to the path where we can load the image. In our case, we'll just put the images in the same folder, so this will just be the name of the image that we want to load. And we'll use Pygame's built-in methods to help load our image based on this name. Okay, so now we have our initializer. Let's go ahead and set up our primary variables. So we'll have self.x is equal to x, self.y is equal to y, self.health is equal to health, and the same with happiness, like so. Okay, so what about the images? Well, we don't need to store the image name because once the image has been loaded, we don't need access to it anymore. However, we do need access to the image itself. So as I said, we can use Pygame's built-in loading methods to help load an image. So we can say something like self.image is equal to pygame.image.load, and we're just going to pass in our image name here. Okay, this will actually load the image found here and store it in our image variable. Okay, so what about the image rect? This is something that we're going to need to help us with the drawing and the collision detection. Well, rather than just getting the default image rectangle from the image itself, because our image once loaded will actually have its own X and Y position and its own width and height. We do want to do something a little different that's going to become clearer as this course progresses. So take into consideration the idea that an item, not the item button, but when we start creating items to place on screen, when we place items on screen, we want to click on the screen and have the item appear at that exact position. Now, I figure it's probably more intuitive to click and have the center of the item be at your click position. It would be kind of weird if I were to click here and have the image spawn like this, with the top left corner at my click position. Instead, what I want to do is click and have that be the middle of our image. Well, by default, with the Pygame coordinate system, 0, 0 is in the top left, so this is x of 0, y of 0, and then this will be width, and this will be height. So in order to, in the future, place our images at the middle of, or rather have the middle of the image at the click itself, we're going to have to alter the X and Y position of our image rect, because as of right now, the image rect 0, 0 is up here. So essentially we want to shift it up and to the left so that the middle will be here. Okay, again, I know this is a little difficult to wrap your head around without seeing this in use, but once we start placing items on screen, the reasoning for this will become a whole lot clearer. Now, the first thing that we need to do is actually get the default image rect, because that will actually determine the width and the height. The width and the height of each item or item button is going to be determined by the image this time, not by some value that we pass in. So we'll create a rect variable, and we'll set this equal to self.image.getRect, and this will get the default rectangle, so that's the default x and y width and height of the image that we passed in, or rather the image that we created. Okay, so the next thing that we want to do is assign self.imageRect equal to a new Pygame.rect, like so, in which we can specify x, y, width, and height. Now the x and the y are the tricky parts. The width and the height will stay exactly the same, as we do want the same size as the image is providing. So temporarily, let's just put xy, and then we want the rect.width and the rect.height. Okay, so what exactly should we be putting for x and y? Well, we know that we want essentially our x and y here to be the center of the image. So essentially we want our 0, 0 points to be shifted half a width to the left and half a height to the top. Well, from the center, this is just half of the width and half of the height. So what we can do is the current x position minus the rect.width divided by 2, and the current y position minus the rect.height divided by 2. So again, the rect.width divided by 2 will just be basically half of the width here, and then half of the height, and that will ensure that our 0, 0 position is in the correct spot for our image rect when it comes to drawing. Now I know this is a somewhat confusing extra step to add in. We could totally work with this coordinate space without creating this separate image rect and going through this trouble, but we will see later on that it's just a lot more intuitive to do things this way. If we can wrap our heads around this particular line of code, then it will make things a lot easier when it comes time to actually place items and item buttons and handle the collision detection. Okay, now I know that last part probably was a little confusing and might take you a couple of minutes to kind of wrap your head around exactly what we're doing there. So I'm actually going to end this section here, and we can finish off the rest in a part 2. So just to really quickly recap what we did so far, we are setting up our X and Y positions, we're setting up the health and happiness, we are passing in an image name that's just a string and loading the image within our initializer. We're then getting the default rectangle that will give us the width and height that we want for this item. And then we are creating our own image rect based on that same width and height, but just shifting it, the X position over to the left and shifting the Y position up top. When we come back, we can load the images into our project and then create and display those buttons. So stay tuned for part 2. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you then. Hello everyone, and welcome back. This is the second half of part 3 of our project implementation tutorials. In the first half, we created our item class. This is really just one big initializer that helps us set up values for X, Y, health, and happiness, and using the passed an image name will load an image. The perhaps confusing part was this line here, in which we're just shifting the image rectangle up and to the left. This will just ensure that when we place an item on screen, the position at which we click is going to be the middle of the item rather than the top left. It just ends up being a lot more intuitive when playing the game. Okay, so if that's still kind of unclear, don't worry, it will hopefully be cleared up in this section once we start placing items on screen. Before we do that, however, there's a couple things that we need to do. We first need to create a bar to house our buttons. This will go at the top of the game screen and will just be an orange rectangle to house our buttons. And then we want to import some images into our project, and we'll use those to display our buttons, as well as any items we place on screen later on. Okay, great. So let's get started with the buttons bar. Let's go down to our game class in the initializer. We are going to need some display variables to determine the size and the color of the bar. So we can have one for the height. Let's call this buttons bar height. and maybe we'll give this a value of 100. And then we'll set the color, so buttons bar color is going to be equal to a new string. Let's set this to maybe orange. Okay, feel free to tweak these values as you see fit. Great, so we've got the display variables. Now we need to actually draw the buttons bar. We don't need to create a separate variable for the bar itself, as it's not really going to be doing anything except being pictured on screen. So we can do the drawing in our draw function here. Now the order in which you draw things is very important, because basically the last thing to be drawn is what will be on top. So we want to always start by clearing the screen, so that's what we're doing here, and finish with the Pygame display update. So we only have one other thing to draw for now, that will be the buttons bar, and we can draw it using the pygame.draw.rect function. Now this will take in a few arguments that are necessary, the first being the surface onto which to draw this bar, so this will just be our self.screen. We'll want a color, well we have that, self.buttonsBarColor, and then we'll need a rectangle, which is going to be a Pygame rect, that will specify our position and width and height. So this is going to be a Pygame.rect, like we've created up here. Okay, so we'll need an X and a Y position because this is going to start at the top left. We can do 0 and 0. And it's going to span the entire width of the screen, so self.width. And as for the height, well, we have a variable for that too. Buttons bar height, like so. Okay, and it's really as simple as that. If we go ahead and run this, we should see our white screen, and we do with our nice orange bar. Okay, so great. That is the buttons bar in place already. Okay, so we can go ahead and minimize that and stop running this. Very cool. So now we've got the buttons bar out of the way, the next step is going to be to import some images for use in the buttons and the items. So that's easy enough using Replit. We just want to find where the images are stored in our project files. We should actually have some images ready for you. Should be an apple, ice cream, and toy.png. And we want to simply drag and drop them into our Replit project. If you are using a different coding environment, then you might have to do something different to get these images into your project, but just make sure that they're in the same folder as the main.py file so that we don't run into any file path issues. From here, now that we have our images, we're going to create a list of those images, or rather the image names, because we'll be using them in a couple of places. So these are the Pygame specific variables, these are the display ones. Let's create our image names down here. So we'll say self.image names. Again, this is still in the game's initializer here. We're going to just load in these three strings, so apple.png, ice cream.png, there we go, and toy.png. Great. Alright, so now that we have those, I'm actually going to close this up because we no longer need access to the files. This just gives us a bit more room to work with. This room is a little tight with a font this big. Okay, great. So now that we have the image names, let's create some buttons. We'll work on the items a bit later on, but again, we can use our item class for these buttons. We are just going to create a separate button for each of these, and rather than put them in a list, I will, because we only have the three, I'll just create them as fields. So we'll start with the Apple button, like so. This is going to be an item. Okay, this is finally putting to use our shiny new item class. If you remember, each item needs X, Y, health, happiness, and image name. Now this is where things get a little bit interesting and where we need to understand the coordinate space a bit more. So within our buttons bar, we essentially have our three buttons that we want to place at non-random intervals. We want them to be at specific intervals. So let's say this is our screen. We want a button at the quarter way, a button at the halfway, and a button at the three-quarter way. That way they're evenly spaced and it looks tidy. How about for the Y position? Well, I figure they should probably be right in the middle of our buttons bar. Okay, this way we have things just looking nice and uniform. Now that's actually pretty easy to accomplish thanks to our image rect, because essentially we can just specify the middle point of our button and then the rectangle will be drawn around it. So for the x position, this is simply going to be our self.width divided by 4 because that will be the quarter point. As for the y position, we want our self.buttons bar height divided by 2. So it will be exactly in the middle of our buttons bar. Next up, we want the health and happiness. These will actually both be 0 because we are not going to be interacting with these buttons at all. The health and happiness will come in later when it comes to placing items. And finally, we want the image name. Well, this is simply going to be self.imageNames of 0. Okay, great. So we've created our very first button, which is an item here. Rather than creating the other two, what I'm going to do is draw out this one, and then I'll get you to try to do the other two yourselves. Okay, great. So we have an Apple button. We'll now go to our draw everything method, and then we're going to do what's called blitting an item onto the screen. So when it comes to images, not just shapes with colors, we need to blit them onto the screen. So on top of the bar, so we'll do the bar first, then the button, we'll do self.screen.blit, like so. Okay, and then we need the image to blit, and then we need the image rectangle so that we know exactly which parameters to display the image in. So for this one, we'll do our self.applebutton.image. Okay, so as the Apple button's image. And then we'll do self.applebutton.image rect, like so. And let's go ahead and run this to see if indeed we are getting that image being drawn. And it looks like we are. Fantastic. So hopefully you can see here, I think the sizing is a little bit off, and that's why we are, I guess I can't change that. Oh, there we go. Okay, so hopefully you can see why this image rect code is important, because we are indeed getting the center of this image at the specified position. If we hadn't done that extra line of code with the image rect here, essentially what would happen is when we go to place it at this position, this would be the top left of the image and it would be displayed like this, which just becomes a lot more difficult when it comes to placing items intuitively on screen. Okay, so now I'm actually going to end this section here and leave you to try the rest for yourself. So we have two more buttons that we want to create. We want an ice cream button and a toy button. And we want to both create them and draw them. This time we want the other two buttons to be in the middle and over on the 3/4 way point. Okay, so go ahead and try that out for yourselves. And of course, I will provide a solution at the beginning of the next tutorial. Okay, so stay tuned. Thanks for watching. I will see you in the next one. Hello everyone and welcome back. This is our project implementation part 3C. If you remember at the end of part 3B, I gave you a bit of a challenge, and that was to essentially create two more item buttons. We created the first Apple button and drew it to the screen here and saw that indeed we are getting that nice Apple image projected onto our orange buttons bar. I then challenged you to create the other two buttons, the ice cream and the toy button, and then draw them to the screen. So here we're just going to go over a solution to that and talk very quickly about the comments. I figured why not make it its own video rather than sticking this at the beginning of the next tutorial. Okay, so this is what we created together at the end of part 3B. And this is the solution to creating the other two buttons. So the only thing that really changes for each of them is the X value and the image name that we choose. So obviously image name 1 and 2 for the ice cream and toy buttons. And then the X position is just going to be halfway along the buttons bar instead of a quarter, and then 3/4 of the way along the buttons bar. After this, we use the same blit functionality, of course, using the correct buttons image and image rects. So by the end, we should indeed see our three buttons projected onto that button bar spaced properly. Very good. Hopefully you came up with something similar. If not, do not worry about it. We are still in the learning process. Okay, so the last thing I wanted to cover here really briefly is just the comments. I know that our code is getting a little cluttered and can be kind of difficult to see everything given this bigger text as well. So I just added comments to each of the methods, kind of explaining perhaps the more intricate parts and exactly what everything is doing. So feel free to pause the video at any point in time and check those out. Otherwise, these comments will be here, and I will continue to add comments at the end of each section to make sure that we understand exactly what's going on. Okay, but that's it. Once we're done this, then we can move on to the next tutorial. So thanks for watching. We'll see you in part 4.